So welcome everybody again. This is our second installment of the League's lecture series. Today we're going to learn about posters and presentations with one of the members of the League's leadership team, Jessica, who's top left corner, who is one of my life coaches. And the reason why this fellowship actually came to be. The idea was born a long time ago, but every single one of these guys that you have met, the medical students here in Michigan that have been working after hours through COVID to make this a reality, mostly because being a resident and doing things that are outside of taking care of patients it's like not compatible with human life. And so trying to do anything or like anything meaningful required, it was truly a team effort. It was mostly lifted on the shoulders of these guys and Jessica, who has the organizational skills of the head of a military operation. And I have learned a lot, and I continue to learn about her every day. She's one of my mentees. She is applying into general surgery along with Kelly, her husband, this season. She's originally from California, which you guys have heard before. And she went to graduate school. She's already a doctor of integrative physiology. She was initially in Colorado and then decided to join us here in Michigan for medical school, where she's going to get her second doctorate, and hopefully stay in surgery forever with me and Kelly, and we can all sail into the sunset together. Jessica has a wide array of research interests. Most recently, she has been working with our transplant group and several of the surgery, our research group, with a focus on more recently on opioid usage and also increasing access to kidney transplantations for minority patients. She is wonderful. I hope that you guys continue to get to meet her over this month, and she agreed to give this talk since she has given many talks and poster presentations and made a myriad of posters, both in the basic science relational science realm and now in a health services research angle, which is more what you guys are doing this month. And hopefully you'll get to learn as much from her as I. Jessica?
Awesome. Thank you, Valeria. I think as you already know from everyone, especially Valeria, we're really fortunate to have her as a mentor. She's really helped guide us through this, and we have a great team. Of course, Kelly, my husband, which I don't need to say much about, but Gracia and Juan, the other medical students that have been amazing for us all to kind of work together and come together. And we're excited to kind of show you as much as we can in this amount of time, and we're really excited because already from meeting you guys, you are very passionate, and it's something that we're all really excited to see. So for this talk today, I'll go ahead and share my screen just to show you, but this is going to be similar. So Ryan gave his talk yesterday, which was a great primer, and that really helped kind of set the tone in terms of how to do research. But this is going to be really also informal, just like yesterday. If you have any questions, definitely just put them in the chat and we can go answer them as we go. And I think for me, this is a really important topic. Like Ryan was talking about yesterday, being able to communicate your research and what you're doing. But like I said, just how Valeria is saying, some background on me on kind of why I'm sharing this with you is that I did my PhD before in integrative physiology, which I kind of feel was a PhD in presenting and posters, because that's what we did a lot of. And in my lab, we had a great group. My faculty PI was really passionate about everything that you do is a product, and you want to put out your best foot forward. And so we had undergraduate master students that I helped put together poster presentations. And then also I helped organize and coordinated a program in Colorado that was similar to this, but for underrepresented minorities trying to be in doctoral STEM programs. And also I gave a similar talk like this. So like I said, this is very informal. So if you have questions, let me know. And then even if Kelly and Gracia, you guys have also given presentations and stuff. So if you have stuff to add, and of course, Valeria, I think it's great to get everyone's insight, because I think one thing too you'll learn about preparing and presenting is also can be a little bit unique to your own style. So take everything kind of with a grain of salt. So for this, just going through when you're doing your research, once you're on the research track, you've been kind of collecting, data for hours, days, weeks for you guys, but eventually even years. And so you've put all this effort into it. And then when you're going to try to convey your research, it's time for you to share your results kind of with the world is what it feels like. But one thing is that you have to be able to communicate your research. So it's really a really important skill. You have to be able to communicate your findings, and you can kind of think about it as, within your inner circle and spreading out. So you can communicate it like to your mentor, to your lab, to your research group, to your medical school, your department. You can present. I had just presented not that long ago to the surgery department, presenting to get funding opportunities, communicating in papers, or at conferences. And then really, even if you do great research, it can be limited if you're not able to kind of communicate it effectively. And so communication of your research is really critical to really have that change that you're hoping to see. And so one thing that I kind of like to think about research is that you're wanting to tell a story. That's the most important thing about research, is that you want to be able to convey it in a way that people can follow. And so you're telling the story of your research. And to me, the way I think about it is that it's being told by two things. One, what you show, so your slides or your poster, but then also what you say is really important. So how you present your research is something that's really important. And so you have to remember that the research in a story is being told by you. So you are the teacher. And so this is one thing I feel like, especially newer students in the area of research, they get a little bit uncomfortable with, but really you're the teacher. You've been doing the research, you kind of become the expert. And so you just have to shift your mind frame. I know everyone's been used to being a learner, but this is an opportunity for you to teach others. And a lot of times people don't know the intricacies of your research like you do. So that's one thing to think about when you're presenting it. So first, just starting with the oral presentations, and then later do the poster presentations. So for the oral presentation, I like to think about it as, like I said, every presentation includes the structure. So the order you present your information, so how to organize your slides so that your story is making sense, but then also the content. So your information of what needs to be part of your presentation to tell the story. So those are kind of the two big parts to think about when you're putting together a presentation. And then one thing too is when you're putting together your oral presentation, you don't have to think about it like you're starting from scratch, because you've already done all this work ahead of time, in terms of getting your research together, thinking about it. So if you did human research, you got approval from the Institutional Review Board and you had to write up something for that. So that's a great framework to start from. Or you've written a study proposal for something else, or you've submitted an abstract. So you can use all these things and then put it into play for when you're putting together your oral presentation. And so just things to keep in mind in terms of kind of do's and don'ts for when you're putting your slides together. So you want a simple background. You don't want something that's kind of too crazy colors that's going to detract from people being able to pay attention to your slides. I like to use animation. People have different opinions on kind of how much animation to use, but I like what I would think hopefully is the right level of it, and that you're able to use in a way that you can direct people's attention, which I'll kind of show you throughout this presentation of ways that I've liked to use it. And then also be careful of your choice of font. So you want to make sure stuff is simple. It can be read. Even sometimes you might think a font looks cool, but it can be difficult to read, especially when people are in the back of the room. And then also be careful of your choice of colors. So again, it's not the time to go super crazy here with like colors, and you want to make sure that you have stuff that's easy to read. So some light colors can be hard to read. And then again, like I said, remember people in the back of the room. And then here, which is perfectly, is avoid filling the slide kind of all the way to the bottom can also be hard. So again, when you're thinking about giving a presentation, so if you can be giving a presentation, anywhere from, like I said, giving it to your research group to the department. You can be giving it for your medical school or the conference, but just think about the room setup, and that if you're giving a presentation and you fill your slide all the way to the bottom, people that are sitting in the back of the room won't be able to really see the bottom of your slides because other people sitting up front might be blocking it. So that's just something to also keep in mind. And then also making the words on your slide big enough so that people can read them and make sure they're readable. You want to be able to draw the readers that you want them to the words you want them to remember, and to use fewer words. So remember your take-home message. That's something that's really important. So to me, this is like hard to read because it's kind of a long text. And so things that you can just do, even if you wanted to have text, is like, okay, make the words big enough and readable. So chunking up and using animation to kind of direct. You're only looking at what I have on the slide. And then you want to draw the reader to the words so you can underline it or do things that might highlight it. You use fewer words. So I think a golden rule that you start to learn about as you present is you really want to use pictures or illustrations or figures anytime you can over words. People just tend to follow it better and remember it, versus sometimes if people have to read a lot of words while you're talking, they're reading the words and they're not listening to you. So it's kind of like competing interests for people. And then the thing too is make sure you're kind of consistent throughout your presentation. So you want to have the same style of words, same font, same like kind of color scheme throughout your presentation, because it'll just look a lot cleaner. And then again, one thing that I can't stress enough, kind of throughout all of your research when you're presenting it in any format, is to remember your take-home message. So sometimes it can be easy to get kind of lost in the details of your research, but remember like what is the point and what you're trying to convey. So always think about, what do I want the person either that's sitting in that room when I'm presenting or coming to talk to me when I'm doing a poster presentation, what do I want them to walk away with, to kind of take from it? And then in terms of presentations for oral presentations, I'll go through a little bit more, but I like to then not only think about the big picture of your take-home message, but then think about the take-home message for each slide. And that's something that I think is really important. And so when I think about how to structure your oral presentation, they kind of all usually follow a similar format. So, you know, you have your beginning to the end, and you typically follow, you know, having your kind of title slide, the first thing. We'll go through each of these, but your disclosure, your introduction, so giving some primer to why you're studying what you're studying, your methods of what you did to study, what you hypothesize, what were your outcomes, and then discussion and conclusions and acknowledgements. So for length of oral presentation, it can really vary depending where you're presenting at. So a lot of times kind of in the surgery world, we have at certain conferences like a 5-minute presentation, which I'll go through later at the ACS or AIC conference. And this is a quick shot presentation, which I'll talk about later. And then, or it can be a 15-minute presentation, or I've given as long as like an hour presentation. It just depends on the format that you're in. For the 15-minute presentation, which I'll go over for you guys next, just because that might be something you might more do for the leagues program. The way I think of the breakdown is the title page, the disclosure slide, an introduction, which I like to think about stuff in time, so like about 2 to 3 minutes. Your methods, similar length, results can be similar length or a little bit longer if needed, and then your discussion and conclusion, and then leaving time for questions. And so some of the kind of golden like rules or tips about that I like to think is when you're giving a presentation, the first thing you want to do, if it's going to be at a conference or if it's going to be even in your department or even in your research lab, like for our transplant research group, I gave a presentation it's probably been like a month ago, but you really want to know what the guidelines are for that organization or wherever you're giving it. So the biggest thing is the length. You want to know how much time do you have, because a pet peeve of a lot of people is when you go over time. And so you really want to make sure you don't go over time. If anything, you can be a little bit short. And then if you're giving a presentation at a conference, make sure they might have specific rules, which we'll talk about the ASC later, but they like number of slides is what they like to go by. So definitely always check before you start your presentation. And then a good thing kind of like with everything is to ask your mentors or peers for samples. So it's something that's really nice, especially if you're unfamiliar you've never given a talk at that place before, you can ask someone who's done it, and you can kind of have something to go off of, and that can kind of help guide you. And then, like I said, I'm not a believer, so if I was told you get 15 minutes to present, 10 minutes is going to be your actual presentation, 5 minutes for questions. Some people like to follow kind of a rule of, okay, I should have, if I'm presenting for 10 minutes, I should have 10 slides and a minute a slide. And that's the way that they like to think about it. But I'm more of a person that I like to go by kind of amount of time I want to spend on stuff, because as I'll show you, as I use animations, I might have, like 25 slides for a 10-minute presentation. And if someone saw that, they would kind of think, oh, wow, you're going to be talking too long. But actually, I found that if I go by the amount of time, I can do that in that time and have simple slides that are a little more concise and to the point, but I just will have more of them because I'll do animation. So like I said, just always check though with the conference, because they might have actual slide restrictions, and that's something you want to make sure you follow. So like I said, just going over the title page and the disclosure. So for the title, again, everything can kind of vary a little bit, but it's pretty straightforward in that you're having your title, you have your name, you can have your PI or your mentor on there and the date, or even if some people like to put the institution, like the conference that they're at, and then you can put your institution, how I put like Michigan down here. And then usually, sometimes the hardest thing for people who aren't used to presenting is the first thing they're going to say. And so people usually get nervous. So even though which I'll talk about later, I already like know kind of my whole presentation, make sure I actually really know my title page, because it's like the first thing I say. So I'll make sure that I'll kind of have that practiced a little bit, because I won't have to be as stressed thinking about it. And I can kind of, start in and introduce myself, the institution I'm from. And then one thing too is I like to thank the conference for having me. So just an example. And so for kind of most of the example I'll show you through this is actually some research that I did before I came to Michigan for my doctoral lab. And this is just an example of my title of my research that I did, looking at like habitual aerobic exercise on age-related arterial dysfunction in postmenopausal women. And then for here, I have my name, my lab, and then my PI, and then my institution. And so the disclosure slide, this is a slide that follows your title page, and it's required at a lot of places like conferences or here in Michigan when you're needing to list any outside or conflicts of interest. So if you have any specific funding or financial stakes or ownerships in companies or intellectual property, this is where you would put it. And then for medical students, usually you don't have anything to disclose. And so this is usually what I say is like, I'm a medical student, so I have nothing to disclose because I don't have any money. So no one's paying me to do anything. If anything, it's the opposite most times. And then just going on to the introduction. So for this part of your presentation, the way I think about it is you want to make sure that your introduction conveys what's the significance. So why should the audience care about what you're going to study? And then what's the background? So what's already known in this area? And then what's the hypothesis? So what do you expect to happen? And so the introduction is really important because you really want to think of your whole presentation, like I said, like a story, but you want it to be a very believable story. So you want to pull people along so that they're not surprised about what's going to happen next. They can almost tell you. So that's one thing, is that it makes it then more kind of, you have them on the same page as you, and it's realistic that when you get to, oh, and this is why we're going to study this, everyone's like, oh yeah, that should be studied, because you already set up a good foundation of like, this is why this is really significant, and this is what's known, and this is what isn't known, and then this is what we're hoping to do to fill that gap, and this is what we potentially expect to happen. And so one thing that I like to also talk about is the slide titles. This is something that I think that is like a really important part of the presentations, but actually really underutilized. So for this, I really like to use these a lot of times to indicate sometimes the message of the slide, the take-home message. So you don't need a slide title at all for every slide. And you want to have as little stuff on the slide as needed, so don't put stuff just to have it there. But I think the slide title, it can be nice to kind of summarize the takeaway point, and I'll show you later kind of example that I do. But it's nice because if someone's kind of not fully paying attention and they look back at your slide and you have a slide title which is basically kind of like a summary, then it's easy for them to be like, okay, oh, that's what I need to know from here. And so you want it to be descriptive, but again, very short, and then clear and easy to read so people can follow it. And then again, with all the slide titles, I like to be very consistent. So I like get very detail oriented in terms of making sure that my slide titles is like identical in terms of the font, the size, where it is, so that when you go to each slide, it doesn't move around. Anything that kind of can be distracting, I kind of try to take that away and make stuff very kind of simple and polished. And then another thing, not just for the slide titles, but throughout, is you want to always, I never like to say the lowest level because I don't like not to be condescending, but I always like to say you want to be able to speak so that everyone in the room understands you. And so I think a lot of times people get, sometimes you've done research and you can kind of start going off and talking about things that are a little more difficult to follow or bigger words. And this, in presentations, that's not the time to do it. Actually, the people that I found are the most brilliant are able to convey stuff that's very simple, like beautifully said, and just kind of to the point, so that it doesn't matter who's in the room, everyone can follow. So if you have a faculty member that's been doing basic science research, if there's an undergrad in the room, my PI is really good at this. He makes sure that everything he says is like, he starts it off so that the undergraduate can follow, and then we'll build up in knowledge, but he's pulling you along so that it's not like, oh, well, that person doesn't understand, and now you start losing people as you go through. And then other information in general on the slides should be short and to the point. So always think about making stuff concise. And then again, make concepts easy for your audience. And then just remember that everyone is not doing the research like you are. So even though you've been doing research, so say you've been here and you're doing it for a month and you've been reading papers or doing stuff and thinking about it, it can be easy for that, certain words or certain things to be second nature for you, but they're not for other people. And so people tend to stick on, if there's an abbreviation they don't quite understand, they're trying to think, what is that abbreviation? And then they're not following you in your presentation. And then, like I said, avoid having too many words, always show pictures if you can, and then always describe what you're putting on there. So you never want to put stuff on your presentation and don't even touch it and don't even get to it, because then it's kind of like a waste of space. So really think about utilizing everything that you put on there. And then for even an introduction, you can use graphs, tables, figures, and this kind of applies to the whole presentation. But you want to use them, like I said, as much as possible. And then, like I said, describe them, but then make sure everything's labeled clearly and people can read it. So if something's not yours, make sure to cite it. And then don't make the slides too busy just by having a bunch of pictures. So one thing that I like to do, and again, it's up to other people, is that I personally, when I'm like starting a presentation, I like to start off by writing out the points that I want to make. And then I start making the slides from there. So I kind of basically have an outline. And I've just done this for the introduction, but I kind of do this for the whole presentation, is that I'll make a quick outline, like, this is what I want to say. And so I want to make sure this is conveyed. And then I start to make slides, and I might even chop up my outline and put them on the exact slides and then work from there. So it's a little bit of a process. So for example, here, this is like bullet points of like the introduction that I would like to make. And so it's like, I would like to be able to say all these things like aging is the primary risk factor for cardiovascular disease, which is the like #1 cause of mortality in developed nations. This is mediated by age-related changes in arterial dysfunction. I want to make a comment about our world demographics is changing. People are getting older. And then interventions have been looked at to slow these age-related vascular changes. But what's been done with exercise, and also that there's sex differences in these age-related changes. And so what's my hypothesis? So right now, if I just put this up here, this is a lot to read. You're probably like, I'm not going to remember like these points, but this is just more of my outline of what I want to say. And then once I have this here, then I'll start chopping kind of each of these almost into a slide. And again, someone might look at this and say, oh, well, this is 6 slides. That's kind of a lot. But literally, I will probably make slides for each of these, and I will pretty much read what this says here. And that probably takes like 30 seconds, maybe a minute, if anything, not too long. So just an example, this is like that first point that I would probably say, like, aging is the primary risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So a picture here is, again, simpler for people to follow. And then, 1 in 3, in the United States die of cardiovascular disease. So again, something that's like simple to follow. And then I might add in, well, with age, there's changes in arterial function, and this contributes to cardiovascular disease. So people already have now this schematic in their head and they're following along. And then basically saying, and the world demographics are changing. This is kind of before, and by 2050, we expect like over 20% of the population to be over the age 65. So a lot more people are getting older. And with this comes all these age-related diseases. And then what I care about is number one, cardiovascular disease. So again, these pictures, people remember it a little bit more and it's easier to follow. And here is where I use my title slide to kind of give a brief summary. So it says the changing demographics of aging. So here it's like you're able to see, it's providing a summary of what kind of the takeaway home point is from this slide. And then again, with my introduction, I'm using that same schematic that people now are already familiar with, and I'm wanting to see interventions with age-related dysfunction, and then aerobic exercise, has been hypothesized and potentially shown to, and especially in men, to reduce age-related dysfunction in arteries. And this is showing, like I said, in men, but the question now that I would have for my research is, well, what's been shown in women? And so this sets up kind of my baseline of what do we know about what's been done in women. And so the other point in the introduction is that I'm trying to make here is that there's sex-related differences in age arterial dysfunction. So if I have this graph up here, I wouldn't just say that and then quickly move on. I would just spend like, 5 to 10 seconds just to say here, we're looking at men on the top and women on the bottom. And here is advancing age in years. And then on the y-axis here, this is a measure of vascular function that you can do in people called flow-mediated dilation, which we don't have to get into now, but you can see that in men, they kind of stay steady until age 40 and then start to have age-related declines, but women actually kind of have steady and have preserved until after age 50 and then have decline. So we see these differences, and one thing that's been shown is actually menopause is a difference between this. So again, not getting to the details of my study, but this is kind of like laying it through and basically walking people through why this is important, and then just highlighting that we see that men and women physiologically aren't equal to each other. So just because a study has been done in men doesn't mean that it can be assumed for women. So I'm setting up the stage of why, someone should do a study in women is what I would hope people would think from this. And of course, here's my hypothesis that is going to be looking at that in women. And for this study, there was reason to believe that actually exercise isn't protective in women. But again, setting everything up for everyone here. So that was the introduction. The next part is the methods. And so for here, you want to make sure you're including information about your study design, techniques or measurements that you did to address your hypothesis. So describe what you did for the study. So if you need to provide some background, even like if you're doing a measure, that's okay. You can do that briefly. And then who did you include, what subjects, if you're doing animal or cell research, what specimens, and then what was your study design? Was it a prospective study? Were you studying moving forward? Is it a randomized control trial? You're doing, chart review, qualitative. That's where you say this here. And an important thing too is how do you decide who's in the study and who's out of the study? And then again, you want to describe your techniques as simple as possible. So you don't need to go into detail if you don't need to. You can kind of leave that for if people have questions as well. And so this is just showing, if I'm going to kind of set up, I want to show people and prepare the stage of a measurement that we do in my lab of looking at how well people's arteries dilate or get larger. And so briefly, I would just describe kind of the mechanism that's important for this. And this is just what this slide is, that kind of my lab that we made. And so this is just looking at, your blood vessels and your arteries and your endothelium, which is the single layer of cells that line them, make a gaseous molecule called nitric oxide, which I'm sure people have heard of, but this actually causes dilation of your blood vessels. And so when it dilates by nitric oxide released from the endothelium, that's called endothelium dependent dilation. And so when you're young, a stimulus will act on this endothelium and cause it to release nitric oxide, and that's nice and robust. But as you get older, that same stimulus act on the endothelium doesn't release as much nitric oxide, so you don't get as much dilation. So here, that's what I would kind of basically say, just so I can get people on the same page of what the measurement I'm going to do. And then what I would move forward is basically then walking them through, which we don't have to go through for my presentation, but this is the measurement that I do. And so you're thinking about, okay, what measurement am I doing? I need to get everyone on the same page. And here it is. And here is like some data just showing what I just said, is that there's differences in age in terms of how people's blood vessels respond. And then you want to convey your study design. And so as you can tell, I have a lot of schematics, and that's something that I think, can be intimidating if you like haven't made presentations and you're basically like, wow, this is a lot of like images and stuff like that. But I think for me, again, it just takes time to get there. And so when you make your presentation, you can put all your words, and then you can start almost like replacing stuff with pictures. And you can either find pictures online that you cite, or you can start to make your own PowerPoint actually with shapes and stuff is a nice way to make things. And so here, my study design, I would include, the women that I was studying at baseline, my inclusion, exclusion criteria of like why I included people, and postmenopausal women is what we included. And then my baseline measures of measuring vascular function that I talked about earlier. And then we did a randomized control trial to have women that were sedentary to either run or not run. And then we just did those same measures after their 12-week intervention. And so kind of a, not too much, but a simpler picture of what we did for the study. And so after methods is your results. And so for that one, that's really important because that's everything that you found in your study. And so again, use the graphs or figures that you're making. And so you want to walk your audience through kind of each piece of your finding, but you want to think about your presentation and that you don't have to present everything you found. You want to present the stuff that's really important that you feel like is impactful for your takeaway message. And so you want to summarize again the main outcome for each of them. So this is just showing kind of the results for my study. And again, I would have, this is the schematic of the image. And I'm actually trying to remember, I made this, I don't know if Kelly, there's a software, and I think sometimes through the schools, if you go through, like Michigan has here, you can go on and log in to Michigan, and they have a bunch of software that you can use for free. And this is actually, I can't remember what the name of the software is, but it's an outlining software where you can literally lay an image down and you can just like draw like a kindergartner an outline over it and then fill in colors that you want, and it can create an image for you. So I actually made this image, and then here this is the graph that I made, and this one I think I made maybe in GraphPad, but you can make your images like in Excel, GraphPad, and they're kind of a nice way to do it. And so here is basically what too is I'm using the title here to kind of take the takeaway. So this is one part where it's like nice because if someone just looks at the graph and I'm not explaining it to them, it might be a little hard for them to understand, okay, what is this showing me? But if they're reading my title, this is basically saying arterial functions impaired with age in postmenopausal women, regardless of their training status. So it doesn't matter if they exercised or not, they had age-related dysfunction. And this image was used for the manuscript, so it's in black and white. But if I was presenting this, I would do different colors because it would just make it stand out more. And you can even animate it to walk people through, where I might show, oh, here's, young, old, like, young women here, older women here, or sorry, young women here, older women here, and then I can animate my kind of finding to show up. So I think animation is a really like useful thing that people don't use as much in their presentations. And then the kind of ending here is that the discussion and conclusion here. So for discussion and conclusion, it's like a really important part where you want to talk about what you learned from your results. So this is like really, you're coming down, this is the take home message. You don't want to interpret your results. So people will kind of jump on you if you're making a huge leap to basically say, oh, we, say you studied in mice, like we found that, this worked to cure mice's cancer, and now we're curing like humans cancer. Like, that's kind of an overinterpretation. So I think you just also want to be careful about how far you interpret your results, and then think about the future directions. And again, starting small, either within your research group, what this means that you're wanting to do, or what this can mean for your institution, or what this can mean for your field. And so here for my study, you're already familiar with this schematic. And now what I'm basically showing here is that, what our study found is that aerobic exercise did not protect, women against age-related arterial dysfunction. So that's kind of the summary takeaway from here. And then your future directions is a way you can also think about what was the limitations of my study. And sometimes people add in a limitations section, but also you can use your future directions to kind of apply that in. So one thing is like, maybe we didn't have enough people in the study. Maybe we didn't know kind of why it didn't work, so the mechanisms, and maybe, this is showing that there's sex differences. And so again, this is a lot of words on here. So in a presentation, I wouldn't kind of just have these listed. I might do something a little more animated to say, more information is needed. We need, an increase in sample size. We need to understand the mechanisms behind, exercise on age-related dysfunction. And we need to study sex differences and other interventions. So kind of using figures and images to help walk people through. And then the kind of last part of the oral presentation, just briefly, is your acknowledgements. So for that is where it's, the slide at the end should probably take like 5 seconds. You just can thank your PI. And on there you have kind of anyone who helped you or was part of the research, any funding. And then one thing that, again, everyone's different with presentations, but I personally don't go through and thank every person. I kind of do an umbrella thank you, like thank you to my mentor, and maybe, the transplant research group or something like that, versus like spending time, because unless all those people are in the room, no one knows who a lot of the people are, so you don't have to go through them all. And this is just an example where it's like, this is my thank you slide showing like my research lab, what funding, and then the key players that were involved in the research of this. And so the very last thing is questions, which sometimes people don't think about, but I think it's actually kind of one of the most important parts, because your presentation, you can rehearse it, and as long as you're come over any like stress or anxiety you have, you're kind of like, that's your protected space where you can present. But then the questions is where it opens up that it's like free game for people. So the question and answer session is a time that like people can get a little bit stressed, but it's a good time to kind of hear what people like are interested in, and maybe also for them to share things that you didn't quite think about. And so just some tips for like doing the question and answer session. Make sure you kind of, I think when you have a presentation, as long as there's not restrictions, end with the question slide, because if you don't, a lot of times you'll get to like acknowledgements, or you'll get to your like conclusion, and then it's very abrupt, like, oh, okay, like what next? So if you have a question slide, it's a very nice thing to end and say, okay, now time if anyone has any questions, like I'd love to take them. And then one thing that can also be helpful is you can also repeat the question back to the person to verify you understand it correctly and clarify for the rest of the audience, and also make sure everyone hears it. So if someone asks you a question and you're not quite sure, you can say, oh, okay, I just want to make sure I'm sure. It sounds like you're asking this. And then they can confirm that that's what they're asking, or they can clarify. And then you can also take a brief pause when they ask you a question to think about an answer and then answer. You don't have to jump on them and have an answer immediately, because they're asking you a question and it's completely understandable for you to think about it. And then one thing too is to make sure to be kind of concise in your answer. So one thing that some people can do is they'll start to drag out their response, or they go tangential and they don't answer the question. So one thing is just to make sure that you're kind of to the point in your answer, and then just make sure you're actually answering their question. And then it's completely okay if you don't know the answer. And one thing you never want to do is anywhere, like act like you know the answer and you don't. You can always say, oh, I don't know the answer, or we haven't thought of that. But if I was to like think it through or speculate, like I would think maybe this. And that's completely, you know, shows that you can think on your feet, but also you're not expected to kind of know everything. And then just really briefly to show you, which a presentation that if you're doing surgery, you might do a lot, is kind of a more of a quick shot presentation. So this was an adjustment for me because when I was in my doctor program, we never did an actual like presentation that was 3 minutes long. But this one is where this is just a link where you can actually go. They have a video of how they briefly walk you through how to prepare that presentation, but they're more strict in that they have 5 slides that they want you to have, and it's not including the title and the disclosure slides. So they kind of have an outline of the number of slides. So just to quickly show you is, you know, for mine, again, here is a presentation I did, and it's my title, my name, and then the people that worked with me, and then the institution here. And then this is my disclosure slide, and this is literally the presentation I gave. And then this is just giving an introduction, so kind of setting up what's known already with opioid prescriptions in the surgical realm. And so here it's just kind of briefly walking people through to get them on the same page. And then this is basically our aim of what we hope to study with this study, looking at post-op arteriovenous fistula opioid prescription. And then the methods, again, very briefly walking them through, you know, who was included in the study for what procedures, during what time did we do this study, and where did we do it at? And then who did we include, who did we exclude, and then how did we measure outcomes? So we did like a phone survey. And then here is the result. So like how many people, you know, did we contact? So this is something that's really important, is when you're doing a study, is it's not just about like the final numbers, but you want to think about almost like a net of where did you throw your net at? And so, you know, we contacted 112 patients and 71 of them responded. And so one thing that's also important is the response rate. So you want to kind of have that information and basic demographics of what was their age, was it equal distribution, men and women? And then for this, we're looking at how many people were prescribed opioids. And then again, very simple, but just having a graph and kind of almost like my title is here of what the findings was. And then, you know, throwing in kind of like a finding of something I thought was important. But again, you know, if I just put this all up together, I think it looks kind of busy. But since I use animation, I'm walking you through it. So you don't realize how busy it is until the end. And then it's like I'm on to the next slide. And then similar here, next results, title page is showing a summary takeaway point that if, you know, people are kind of like, this is hard to follow, but I would be describing this. So if I have this figure, and that's what I did, is I would briefly go through and orient people and say, oh, this stuff, you know, for this outcome, we looked at oral morphine equivalents that were prescribed here in dark gray and light gray that were consumed, and that's number above each of these bars of the oral morphine equivalents. And then we broke it up into 2 groups of patients that were prescribed preoperative opioid prescription chronically for another condition versus people who weren't, and we looked to see if there was difference. And so you walk people through very cleanly your figure there, and then you can have a takeaway point. And then summary, again here, this is a picture that's, you know, you're describing it, but it's better than having all the, you know, text laid out and being like, oh, you know, 2/3 of people that were prescribed opioids for their arteriovenous fistula postoperatively actually did not consume them. And only 50% of people consume like any opioids. So again, you're using pictures to kind of describe everything. And then a takeaway point is that we actually here at Michigan changed our opioid prescribing based on these results. And so you're showing, you know, bringing them all along and then kind of giving the like final point that you're hoping to make. So some more things just to keep in mind is be careful when you're presenting. So like I said, people do it differently, but a lot of people like to write out their whole presentation. And some people actually like to have that with them when they're presenting. And I think you just want to make sure that you're careful that when you're presenting, you're not reading to the audience. So it shouldn't feel like you're reading a script to them. You want it to feel like a story, and that it's a little more animated and you're pulling them along versus just reading kind of a monotone script. And you want to remember that you're teaching them. So you want to make sure that you're describing things in a way that is kind of intriguing to them. And then another thing that's really important is actually you talk slower than you think you need to. Like, so slow down. I think a lot of people think they start to present and it might be a combination of nerves or also you're not used to talking that slow, but actually I always recommend people talk a little bit slower than they think. And then just be mindful of using jargon or kind of incorrect grammar. You just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page of understanding it. And then, like I said, I like to use animations, but just be careful not to go overboard and that it's like animation bombs in your face. Again, you want it to be clean and easy to follow. And then think about your transitions between your slides. So you don't want each slide to feel like a separate, completely separate component of the story. You want it to be tied along. So a lot of times, when I'm making a slide, I'm already thinking about the next slide because it should feel like a natural progression. But I like to use kind of a transition between that. So I might say, cardiovascular disease, #1 cause of death in the United States. And I might say, however, and as I'm like even saying, however, I'll transition to the next slide and say, however, like it's not known, whether or not aerobic exercise. And it feels like a very smooth transition than kind of like, one slide, I'm waiting, next slide after that. And then one thing too, when you're presenting, it's different. We're in virtual realm now, where everyone's new to, but when you're up there presenting, wherever you're at, be mindful of your body language. It's something that you might not even notice until someone else watches you present, but you just want to make sure that you're not too fidgety. You're making good eye contact. You don't want to be just reading from a screen, whether you're reading from the computer in front of you or the screen behind you. You want to make sure that you're looking around to the room and then that you're kind of not going crazy with your arms and stuff like that. And then one thing that's really hard for a lot of people is your ums and your likes. I know I probably still have issues with this, but before I think I originally said likes too many times. And that's something that's hard, but then I think I transitioned to saying ums. So it's just something that it's natural for people to want to fill any pauses. And a lot of times we do that without even realizing it. And we fill it often with the or a like. And so pauses are completely fine and appropriate because it's, just part of the natural kind of way of people talking. And so you don't need to kind of fill those pauses with any other words. And then one thing that I'm a big on is, I love, it's weird to say, but I love like making presentations. It's just kind of almost feels like cathartic to put together a presentation, put together stuff. And I'm very detail oriented, probably like Valeria said, but to me, it's, I pay attention to like the details on my slide because then it makes things easier to focus on what your message is. So if you take away any errors, any like inconsistencies, I really think of those as distractions that are gone, and then they can just really focus on you and what you're trying to tell them and your like great research that you're doing. And then again, the point that I had said earlier, but I think is really important, is for each slide, thinking about what's the takeaway message. And you don't want to have a slide in there that's not needed. So you want to think about what's the takeaway message and is this conveyed as simplest and best as it can be? And then for your entire presentation, what's your takeaway message that you're hoping people to walk away with? And then additionally, just when you're doing your presentations, you want to make sure you're dressing accordingly. So I always assume business attire unless they specify otherwise. And then one thing that I've really gotten from my like doctoral lab before is kind of everything you do is a product and can be a reflection of you. And so you want to do your best because you put that kind of best foot forward, and you never know who's in the room watching or listening to you. In terms of, it can provide a great opportunity that someone can say, oh, you gave a 3-minute presentation, that was really great, and I wanted to like ask you more about this. And so I think if you just try to do your best, that never fails. And then again, knowing your audience. So when you present, know who's going to be in the room. So you don't have to if you're giving a presentation to like your research group and they all know kind of basic level stuff, everyone does, you don't have to include information that wouldn't be relevant to them. So keep in mind of who you're going to be presenting to. And then just logistics, check your presentation on a PC, on a Mac, just to make sure that there's no like logistical errors. Like save your presentation on a USB, email a copy to yourself, have everything around, because it's just really helpful to, want to get to a conference, which, it happened to my friend last time, but I think Gracia was there with me. I had a USB, and we were able to like, not Gracia, but someone else like put the presentation like on the USB and she was able to upload it. But it's like you want to carry all that stuff so that you don't have to stress about, do I have my presentation or not? And then, to me, like your presentation does take a little bit of time, I think, to get it to like be kind of a really good level. And so I always like to create it, early, because you can kind of change things around. I don't do that now because I'm used to like making presentations, but before I would like take a lot of time just to make sure, to give myself, instead of having to cram to the last minute. And then the most important thing, about anything, but especially presentations, is practice. So everyone gets nervous when they first are learning to present or doing it, but I guarantee you, practice is the best way. Like practice never hurts anyone. And so, like I said, a lot of people will write out your presentation like word for word and practice it, and then have it with you if you needed, like when you present. Everyone has different styles. Some people like to literally take it up to the podium with them when they're presenting, or sometimes in PowerPoint there's presenter mode and you can put your notes under there. But I always caution against that, because you don't know at the conference what their presenter modes are like. And so sometimes it's where there's like, this one has like, there's no notes underneath. And so if I had counted on that and I didn't know what I was going to say, then I could be really stressed for it. But if you have your presentation with you or handy, then that's something that you don't have to worry about. And then again, making sure you're on time. That's one thing for your presentation, is you don't want to be running late. Even if you gave a great presentation, some people are like a stickler, and that it's like, well, this is running over, and that can kind of erase the great work that you just did. And then you want to practice it as much in a real setting as possible. So even if it's nerve-wracking, you'd want to practice like going through the slides, standing up, doing it how you kind of would do it in the real time setting, and then practice to your peers, like your mentor, your research group, especially if you're going to like a conference, and get feedback on things that were hard to follow, because you might kind of have blind spots to what you think should be done. So before I go on to the poster presentation, does anyone have any questions about like the oral presentations? We can also wait and do questions at the end, but I just wanted to check if anyone had questions.
So like, I know research projects, they sometimes require dozens and dozens of references. So do we not have to add like a reference slide for maybe like the most important references that you feel were the most useful for your research?
Yeah, so it can vary. So you can add, like if you want to add a reference slide at the end, you definitely can. People usually just like skip over that. So I'm not really a reference person at the end. I usually will add maybe a brief like references as I go. So if I like have a like before, if I included like images from a study, I include that reference there. But some people like to put it at the end, and I think that's fine too. But usually it's always an awkward slide that people get to and they just skip over. So I think it's just kind of stylistic on what people like to do. Awesome. Okay. If people have more questions, we can do them at the end too. But so that was like the oral presentations. And so, it will vary in terms of different conferences. You can do either an oral presentation or a poster presentation or both. But for poster presentations and preparing them, it's pretty similar actually to an oral presentation. So again, when you're making a poster, you're gonna use the work you already did. So you don't, you're not starting from scratch. You're going to use your institutional review board, abstract, oral presentation that you might have already given that will be helpful. And then it's exactly similar format and concepts to an oral presentation. So the key things of a title, having a background, a methods, results, and conclusions and future directions. And so all the poster presentations I've done, I've always used PowerPoint to create your poster. And then I've done this, and I still do this, even though I've made posters in the past at my lab. When I came here, I actually asked Ryan Howard, that I was working with on the opioids thing, for a sample of his poster presentation, because I was doing mine on opioids and he's opioid expert. And so it's like, you don't need to reinvent the wheel for stuff, because you just want stuff to be the best that it can. And so always ask people, and people are more than happy to kind of share with you samples to kind of help you, and you don't have to rethink about how to format, especially for a poster in Word. I don't think I've ever made a poster presentation in PowerPoint, where I didn't use someone's as a starting point, because the formatting is kind of funky. And then also some conferences actually have template samples that you can use, so always check there as well. And then you also want to make sure you know the poster size guidelines. So each conference can be a little bit different in how they want you to print your poster presentation. And then with your poster, especially if it's like your first time, I really, really recommend starting early, because you have to draft your poster, but then you also want to send it to your co-authors for feedback. And then it gets printed. It can vary at where you're at. So maybe your institution has a place that you can print it, where your department will pay for it and they'll print it, or you can go to like FedEx is where I think here at Michigan, where we went last time, and they can print it. But you want to give yourself more than 2 days if possible, but like 2 days is like pushing it, because also your poster needs to dry. So you want to make sure it's dry before you roll it up and put it in the tube. So this is just kind of a sample of the one that I did here for Moses Gun one. But for the poster presentation, you want to lay out your poster, how you're going to present it. That's kind of the best way. So I'll say it again later, but I kind of think of like Vanna White, and that you're going to be standing in front of your large poster, and you want to have it laid out so where you can kind of talk through it, and you're going to be like showing like, oh, and here's like an important point, and you can actually point to it and have it be interactive, instead of you just like talking about your poster and your poster's over there and it feels like kind of two separate entities. And then your format a little bit, where exactly, so background, methods is pretty similar, but like results, conclusions, where exactly stuff is laid out in order might depend a little bit depending on how much data you have. So if you have a lot of data, your results might take up a big part. If your study is really methods focused, you're doing new cool methods, then your methods might be bigger. And then I'm really big, I didn't mention this before, but like for even the oral presentations on like color scheme, I like having, it's funny, even before here, kind of like the maize and blue have always been the colors I use. So I use that like in all my oral presentations and then as the poster here. But you don't want to go like too, again, like crazy and funky and have it be like detracting. You want it to be polished and then use it to help things kind of stand out. And so just briefly going through, so the background here, this is just, again, example, but you're going through the same exact stuff that you're including in your poster that you did your oral presentation. So significance. So why should people care about what you're studying? And that this is what this is showing is like, this is why, this opioid research is significant. And that, surgeons are prescribing a large variation in their opioid prescription. And then what's already known or what's been shown. And so, or also what's unknown, because that's setting up for what you want to do. And then what's your hypothesis? So what are you proposing? And sometimes it feels kind of like, oh, basic to be literally writing out your hypothesis. But the hypothesis is really important because it lets everyone know that this is what you were studying and this is what you thought you anticipated. And so everything's going to center around your hypothesis in terms of how you set your study up. And then for the methods, again, here, so this is where you're going to talk about your study design that you use to address your hypothesis. So, your study design. So for this one, it was like a retrospective and prospective chart review that we did, what was being assessed or what was being studied, and then what was the time frame that we did it, and then who did we study, and what allowed people to be in or out of the study. And then what techniques did we use or outcomes. So two, you can use, everyone has a preference. You can use more pictures if you want for stuff, even in the introduction. I didn't use that many pictures for this poster, but for other ones, I've used more pictures, like the one I showed for the oral presentation in my old research. I've used those pictures in it, but you just want to make sure that it's clean and easy for people to follow. And then for the results, I'll talk about them here, and then on the next slide is the results from there. But again, you want to use figures, tables, more than words in terms of any spot that you can, just because again, when someone's walking up to a poster, they're not going to want to kind of read your whole poster. But if you have key figures and tables, then that will help them be able to understand. And you also want to make sure that you don't have figures and tables up there just to have them. So you don't need to fill, I think a lot of people think they need to fill their poster just to fill it, but it doesn't have to be this like jam-packed thing. You want to have what's highlight the most important stuff on there and for people to kind of walk away with it. And so like I said before, you can make your figures, your tables in Excel, Word. Again, our University of Michigan has where we can use GraphPad for free through them. And then lay out your figures how you'll present them. So again, like I said, kind of Vanna White style, you want it to be in the order that you can kind of go through it. And then you don't want your results to be like super difficult to understand or super difficult to follow. It's, you know, in a perfect world, if you weren't at your poster for some reason, someone could come up and read it and understand it on their own, and they wouldn't be looking at your results kind of being confused. But it's sometimes understandable that if it's like different types of techniques or results might be a little bit hard for someone to just be able to follow on their own, but you want to make sure that it's simple, that you could kind of very simply describe it to them and point to it. And then like I said, in the results, it's also nice to use a color scheme to kind of break up the section and make things pop a little bit more. So just as an example, like here's the results from the poster that I made, and if it was all kind of black, you know, it would kind of be monotone and nothing really popping out. And this is busy in that there's a lot of information on here, but kind of, you know, when I go through to present it, I don't necessarily go through and present every little thing. I, you know, go through and highlight kind of important things and very quickly, you know, how we had 112 like patients that we surveyed. We had 65% respond, and 87% of them were prescribed opioids after their surgery. And here you can see kind of the distribution of patients that were prescribed opioids in blue. And so kind of the median is over here towards 80 oral morphine equivalents versus the use, which is more kind of leftward shift, where you're seeing that a large percent of patients, almost 60%, actually didn't use any opioids. So you can see that variability. So very briefly, I describe that to them. Then I can go through, and again, I don't have to describe all of this. And I kind of used this actually more to be my little pop outs here are really some of the big takeaway points that I tell people that were listening to it. And so I think it's just thinking about what's important to be on here and what isn't, and conveying it in a way that's easy for people to follow. And then the last part of the poster presentation is the conclusion and future directions. And this is actually a really important part, because a lot of times if you haven't given a poster presentation, I think it's a little more awkward than, I like the oral presentations because you're up there, you can present, but the poster presentation sometimes can be awkward because you're standing in front of your poster, and Kelly knows because Moses Gunn, and people are like walking by, and it's the awkward, like, are they going to make eye contact? Are they going to come over? And you're kind of looking at them and you're like, you know, you can come over, but it's a little bit, right? And when people come over, they're not going to read your whole poster. And sometimes people aren't even like, oh, you don't even need to give me a spiel. Like, I'm just going to look at it. And a lot of times what people look at is the conclusions, because if they don't have to read your whole poster, and they can just say, what are you telling me from here? What did you do? And so it's an important part to make sure that it kind of clearly states what you found. And then it's nice if you can use pictures here, but sometimes I get torn about pictures in the conclusions if it's hard for someone to follow if you're not there. So for here, I opted to like use words, but it had like the most important parts. And then I made words like bold or bigger that I really wanted people to kind of get away, so that literally someone was like, I'm going to look at your conclusions and only take 5 seconds to look at it. And I can see like, oh, they consumed less than a third of the opioid pills they were prescribed. 50% didn't consume any, and we changed our prescribing guidelines. Got it, next poster. And so this is like an important part too, I think, in your posters that sometimes people overlook. And then just some like tips for presenting on your poster. So when you do your poster presentation, it's actually good to have like and prepare what we call like an elevator talk. And so what that is literally like what it sounds like if you stepped into an elevator. I don't know if I've been in an elevator that actually is 2 minutes, but that's what they always say is be able to prepare a very brief like 2-minute presentation or even shorter where you're describing your research project kind of start to finish. And this is a good thing to learn in general, because no matter where you go is, you know, when someone asks you about your research, whether you're meeting a new mentor for the first time, if you're in the operating room when you're interviewing, if you kind of have this in your back pocket to be able to give like in a 1-2 minutes, oh, this is what my research is. It's a great skill where people can kind of engage in it pretty easy. And so this is good to have for your poster, and that you have a very brief presentation where you're like, I could walk you through, and probably for surgeons, I'd probably say like a minute, like my poster in a minute. And then, like I said earlier, I really think utilizing your poster, so don't just like neglect it. Use it to point out key information, like I said, Vanna White style. And then make sure to remember, and this applies to when you do your oral presentation too, is to be like excited and passionate about your research. So you know clearly did this because you were interested in it. And so one thing is like you want that to convey when you're talking to people. And just think about when you talk to people about research, if someone's just like, oh, I did this research, you know, next, that doesn't really sound like you're like, well, why am I going to be excited about it if you're not? But if someone's telling you, you know, we found this, I was really frustrated about this question, and when we looked into it we found this, and this was really exciting and surprising, and so we're hoping to do this, that's just more engaging. And that's what you want to make sure that you remember even through the nerves of presenting. And then one thing that some people do is that sometimes they have a small printout. Like if you go to a lot bigger conferences, you can have a little like paper size printout of your poster that has your like email on it. And so sometimes people have had this happen from before in my like research lab at bigger conferences. They'll come and they're excited about your research and they want to know more. And so they might either like take a picture or they might want like your email. And so sometimes if you have like business cards, that's another way for people to contact you. But we're also shifting like social media. Everyone can follow each other like super easy. So this is probably will be outdated pretty soon. And then again, for your poster presentation, you want to make sure you dress professional. I remember one of the postdocs in my lab had said that there was a study that found that people that were like color coordinated to their poster had greater like response to people like engaging with it. So you don't have to go like crazy, but just make sure you're like dressed professional, and then to make sure you're at your spot on time and you're staying there for the duration you're assigned, and to be engaged, because you don't want someone to come by and you're not there, or you're not really like interested and you're just like chit chatting across the room, because you want to make sure that you like capitalize on that time. And then that's all I have for the poster and oral presentation stuff. So if anyone has any questions, definitely let me know.
So what's like an average
Yeah.
size for a poster?
Yeah, this I just had Kelly. So it can vary by, I literally was like, Kelly, what is it? I can't remember, because I remember in my lab, the conferences I went to, I think it was like 3 by 6. I'm trying to remember. There's like a standard thing that prints out, but then depends at each conference that you go to, they have a standard size. So I recommend just that they will tell you that, but look at their website, because some of them can really vary. Like I think was it the American College of Surgeons was like 4 by 8, it said, which is huge.
And then there is the virtual posters too. So like some of the fancier conferences, I think that the Academic Surgery Congress did this 2 years ago. They had like the AV system on the venue, allow for them to have like the posters displayed on these TVs, which is actually like really, I mean, like if you think about it, you guys will soon, maybe Priscilla, you have done this before. I did it as a student, traveling around with this like huge mailer with your poster that like looks like a bazooka, and you're like trying to get around the airport with it. It's actually like not super reasonable. I mean, it's fine. People also like ship a lot of conference material stuff too, and then like poster gets lost or the poster gets damaged, and there's this whole ordeal. So I remember that's the only time that I can think of that they had like these TVs, and it actually was nice because then they will have like a rotating kind of set of people coming and giving their poster presentations, staying there by the screens. But I agree. I echo what Jessica said. Like usually, like that information is usually available. So as like you put your abstract together and you're like, oh, I need to like put whatever preliminary results that I have gotten into a poster. That information should, depending on which conference you're sending it to, or you have been accepted, that's kind of like past the accepted area, you will have that information available.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, so pet peeves, don't be the person that prints out individual page sizes of your poster and collages them together. I've seen that. I think posters is not a time, like it's a time, like I like posters because you can be a little bit creative, or not as creative, but like, you can color scheme, you don't have to be like as boring, and I love that. But it's also not the time to like really deviate. So I've seen like cloth posters or just things that it's like, just stay within the norm, and then be professional, and like have your, even at Michigan, like we do, our Moses Gun is like a small, their conference. But like I said, I use every opportunity to try to put forward like the best presentation I can. And so even if it's at your local institution, you don't want to have, again, collage of like pieces on there. You want to kind of be as like professional as you can.
And I agree with Jessica. Sometimes like you will like present a poster at a couple of different places too. Like that's something that also will happen. And then like treating every presentation, every conversation that you have with everybody coming to your poster as like that's like it. That's like the person. That's like the program director that's gonna give you the job, like the plastic surgery job that you wanted or whatever it is. Makes it so that you set standards within yourself to like be on the game. Because the other thing about poster presentations that can be challenging is that sometimes they're big. Like sometimes they're like 200 posters and you're like, does anybody care about my research? And the answer is likely. However, like the nature of poster presentations is that you're like, showing your like wares. And then like people like circulating around might have different levels of engagement with the information you're presenting. And some people like glancing by versus some people engaging into conversation. Poster presentations are also usually only a couple of hours. So your poster will be up for the length of the conference. They will have it in like some big auditorium. But then like your actual time by your poster will only be usually a couple of hours. So kind of maximizing on that time if you get the opportunity of presenting a poster is very important. Jessica, that was fantastic. Like that was super comprehensive, and I hope that you guys found it helpful. It has like I remember being a student and like putting my first poster together, and like I know as a medical student without previous research background, I actually think I carry myself. I think I put my first poster together as an undergrad, and I was like in a research heavy institution. But there is like not that many, like it's like all this information is like piecemeal in a bunch of places. And then sometimes like your mentors or like the senior members of your lab or whoever you're doing the research with can like explain a lot of like the granularity of what needs to and doesn't need to go in a poster, and like some of this like untold rules of just sharing research. So I will encourage you to save this YouTube link, whatever folder it lives. And like whenever you're wondering like whether or not something needs to be or not be in your poster, if you're struggling to figure out how to make something make sense in a presentation, I think this was probably like the best holistic overview of like the basics of what you need to know to put together like a reasonable, well-structured professional presentation or poster. So that was super.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, I literally feel like I got like a PhD. I was telling Kelly, a PhD in presenting because I did, but I think for me, I enjoy it now. But I think it's something that's the thing, you ask for help is what I would recommend. Like it's not a time that you have when you're putting together presentations that you have to figure it out on yourself, because like Valeria was saying, is that everyone has kind of all this knowledge and information that they just expect you to have because you just get it over the years, but there's not like a source for it. But always just ask and people will give their opinion. And it's presentations also is a little bit opinion based. So just because one person says something, that doesn't mean that that's like fact. Everyone has different styles of how they like to do it. And I think, I don't know if you would know better, Valeria, from like the surgery world, I would say is they're not, so I come from a very like strict lab of Kelly knows, like presenting and doing stuff. And that my PI, I love him, but he is very, very specific about how he likes things. And he gets very frustrated when small things don't go into place. And I feel like a lot of people in the surgery world are a lot more relaxed, and like just excited about the research you do. But when you put together good presentations, they're very impressed, and very receptive to that. And I think that's something that if you get that skill, it'll carry over to any time you have to talk about anything, which is helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that some of like the perceived flexibility comes from kind of like the many different corners of surgery from where like people are producing knowledge. So like not all of us are within like a basic or translational realm. And then like the flavor of like the surgeon scientist and the surgery researcher are like literally going to like Ben and Jerry's and looking for ice cream. And so the basics of like how to present yourself professionally and how to give a professional presentation and like really communicate what you did, which is hard. And sometimes you even think that is going to be hard because like if you put this together, you have to spend time doing your research, like you know the project in and out. I remember my first poster presentation was about C. elegans, which is like a nematode. And it was about something that like I still like when I think about it, I was like, yeah, I talked about it during my medical or during my residency interviews because it's like one of the very few publications that I have. And I think that at the basis of it all, like being excited about your research and being able to like even having done the work still won't take you to that threshold of being able to effectively communicate in a written form, in papers, or in a verbal form, like what you have done. So you could be curing cancer, whatever it is that you are. And if you're not able to attain a set of skills that, regardless of your personality type, of like whatever or not speaking in like big groups is your thing or whatever, but like finding out a way of taking your research and communicating it to others in written, grant, or presentation form can be a very big setback. And if you are able to do that like efficiently, you will find that like even like small bits of information can be presented in a compelling way, and that will lead to like mentoring relationships, collaboration relationships, and people starting to respect you as a presenter, even from the point in which you're a student. So every single opportunity that you have to present your work is important. And I think that this is a really good pathway for you guys, a framework for you guys to start having as you're doing this more often.